The articles contained in this volume have been written by the various authors independently. For the title, the preface, and for such general argument as is to be found in the book as a whole, no responsibility necessarily attaches to the writers, who are answerable each for his own contribution, and for that only, the title suggests that the principle of free exchange is capable of inspiring a constructive policy in which freedom is limited only by a mutual respect for the freedom of all, that is, by the reciprocal responsibility inherent in every voluntary act of exchange. The articles have been arranged, as far as possible, according to the natural sequence of thought, and for this attempt to give an appearance of unity of design, the editor is alone responsible. The first paper, from the pen of Mr. H.D. Mackay, gives an historical sketch of the course of economic speculation with regard to the doctrine and policy of free exchange. He traces the rise of freedom of internal and international trade, from the teaching of the French economist Adam Smith, and points out how the misconceptions of Ricardo and his followers on the subject of value have led mankind astray, and confused in the most mischievous manner all our ideas on the economic mechanism of society. Free trade, he argues, is the first great benefit which just economic reasoning has conferred on this country. The task before this and the next generation must be the clear establishment of the truth that a largely increased production of wealth and its equitable distribution among all classes of. Viate preface. The population can be attained only by developing the facility and the multiplicity of exchange. In other words, by free exchange, and, further, that this rule is applicable to all forms of value, whether they be labor or credits or material commodities. Mr. Maitland draws attention to a problem of the immediate future. The adoption of free trade by America will produce, without doubt, great industrial changes, if we are to retain our markets in face of the decreased cost of production which this policy will permit in America. We must cast off from us all unnecessary burdens and all unnecessary restrictions. Mr. Maitland's argument is designed to show that our political leaders are very little alive to the reality of this danger. Changes, such as he forecasts, can only be met by permitting the principle of free exchange to be the distributor both of capital and labor. It is one of the evil consequences of protection that, even when men become persuaded of its injustice and folly, they cannot return to free trade without causing considerable economic disturbance. We are about to encounter an industrial crisis arising from this cause, and it is Mr. Maitland's argument that such redistribution of the industrial markets as is inevitable will come on us more gradually and with less suffering if we accept the principle of free exchange in every relation of life thus encountered. The process of change need have for us no terror, for it must ultimately lead to an ever-increasing satisfaction of human wants at an ever-decreasing expenditure of human exertion. Mr. Strachey gives an account of the Ateliers Nationaux of Paris in 1848. The attempt was there made to give labor a right to force the community to purchase it for wages. This violation of the principle of free exchange rapidly in 3 months' time produced anarchy and revolution. Mr. Fortescue's paper deals with a somewhat similar attempt in our own colonies to carry on civilization by that vast system of public works which is most briefly described under the term state socialism. Another aspect of the same problem is treated by Mr. Hooper from the purely financial point of view, the pledging R&D. Preface. Eeks. Of the credit of taxpayers for government borrowing and government trading is a contravention, possibly in many cases a necessary contravention, of the principle of free exchange. Mr. Hooper shows how treacherous a basis for the expansion of industry this method affords, and how readily it lends itself to the creation of disastrous financial complications. Mr. Ackworth deals with the vexed question of state interference in railway management. He shows what a limited amount of truth there is in the allegation that a railway is a monopoly. On the important question of tariff legislation, subject to the necessity of state interference legislative, judicial, and executive for the purpose of preventing undue preferences and unreasonable discriminations, he is disposed to leave the public and the railways to deal with each other on the principle of free exchange. In most other respects, he suggests that more advantage will be gained by an enforcement of publicity than from any other form of regulation. Just as in the great free trade controversy, the maxim was laid down that a hostile tariff is best combated by a more thorough free trade, so Mr. Ackworth argues that the difficulties arising out of an alleged monopoly, like a railway, are best overcome, not by turning it into a real monopoly in the hands of a government department, but by subjecting it as far as possible to the health-giving influence of publicity and free exchange. Mr. Mackay's paper deals with the principle of free exchange in its relation to the property of the working classes in their own labor and in their own savings. The argument seeks to justify the opinion that free exchange is capable of becoming to labor what a right of free mintage is to bullion, viz., a certain guarantee of employment and wages. Further, that, in the vast series of exchanges which constitute the economic mechanism of a free community, the value of labor must unceasingly tend to enhancement. It is therefore to the organizing influence of free exchange that labor has to look for the realization of its legitimate ambition. Here, the controversial portion of the volume may be said to end. The two papers which follow, though not strictly preface, speaking, covered by the title, have a relevance which is sufficiently obvious. Mr. Mallett's paper is a theoretical discussion of one aspect of the interesting problem of taxation. The principle of progression or graduation has been already, as he points out, either avowedly or unconsciously adopted in the financial system of most civilized countries, and its extension is to be looked for in the future. Unless the theory be deliberately adopted that taxation is to be used as a lever for redressing the inequalities of fortune between the different classes of a community, there is, he thinks, much exaggeration, both in the fears and in the hopes which this proposal evokes. In the distinction, as stated by Jevons, between value and utilities, he finds a defense of a progressive as opposed to a merely proportional rate of taxation, but he shows that at a point which can only be discovered by actual experiment, the abstraction by the state of the surplus wealth of individuals may become not merely a deduction from the wealth of a country, but a positive bar to its further growth. Further, that taxation is just and politic when it aims at equalizing the sacrifice imposed on individuals, but that it is the reverse when it seeks to equalize incomes. Mr. Littleton, in explaining the state of the law with regard to trade combinations, has adhered strictly to the legal aspect of the question. If there is any force in the argument contained elsewhere in the book that, as regards labor as well as all other forms of wealth, free exchange and not coercive combination should be our rule of guidance, it is obvious that an estimate of the intricacies of the law of trade combinations is an interesting and pertinent addition to the controversy, even though, as in this case, the writer confines himself to a statement of fact and takes no responsibility for the general argument in which his narrative may serve as an illustration. Thomas Mackay. Synopsis of contents. First, the science of economics and its relation to free exchange and socialism. Present chaotic condition of economic speculation, its cause, due to neglect of proper definition of the subject matter of a science. Adam Smith. Not the founder of economics and free trade. Political science due, like medicine, to the sufferings of mankind. Its birthplace was France, page 4. Early attention paid to theory of money, but true principle of trade much misunderstood. 5. The sect of the economists. Their opinions, their contention in favor of free trade. 6. An abstract of their doctrine, establishing liberty and the right of property as fundamental principles of civilized society. 7 to 10. Their doctrine concerning commerce, their assertion that exchangeability is the essence of wealth, their denial of the title of wealth to labor and credit. The error of this exclusion demonstrated. 10 to 15. The service rendered by the economists in exposing the fallacy of the balance of trade doctrine that in every exchange one side was a loser. 15. Their opinion that neither side lost or gained, that labor engaged in agriculture was the only productive labor, all other labor sterile and unproductive. 15. 16. Such doctrine provocative of reaction. Adam Smith and Condillac show that in commerce both sides gain. The immense importance of this demonstration. 17. Adam Smith's further criticism of the economist shows the error of confining term wealth to material products of the earth. He includes labor and credit in the category of wealth, but later on loses sight of this and proposes various irreconcilable definitions. 18 to 20. The confusion introduced by J.B. Say's adoption and misconstruction of one expression of the economists, production, distribution, and consumption. 21. J. S. Mill, the disciple of Say. His definitions of wealth, their inconsistency. In the hands of Say and Mill, the science brought to an impasse. 21. 25. Summary of the bearing of doctrine of economists and Adam Smith on free trade. Various infringements of free trade considered and shown to be robbery, protection, slavery, the law of the maximum, all are forms of socialism. 25 to 30. Error of supposing that England, synopsis of contents, should abandon free trade because other nations have not adopted it. If one tariff is bad, 2 are worse. 31. Next, the relation of economic speculation on socialism. This turns mainly on the definition of value. 34. The contradictory statements of Adam Smith, the true theory held by economists and the ancients, error introduced by Locke. Adam Smith's doctrine considered at length his hopeless attempt to make labor an invariable standard of value, its inadequacy demonstrated. 35 to 40. The same confusion throughout Ricardo, his dogma that labor is the foundation of all value, its obvious untruth. 40, 41. McCulloch and Carey take the same view. 42. The importance of this doctrine consists in the fact that it is made the foundation of socialism. The doctrine that working men are the creators of all wealth and value, tested by 10 examples. 43. Credit, its nature, and the obvious absurdity of saying that working men have given it its value. 44%. Credit is a mass of exchangeable property, in the creation of which manual labor has had absolutely nothing to do. 45. The alleged equity of socialism based on the Ricardian doctrine of value is thus disproved. 46. Labor has value as being exchange able, and there is no reason to withdraw it from the operation of the principle of free exchange, which is at once equitable and beneficent. 46. Conclusion that the basis of value is exchangeability, and that the chaotic state of economics is due to the neglect of this principle. 46. 1. Zweite. The coming industrial struggle. The inaugural address of President Cleveland suggests that the Manchester School, if dead in England, has come to life again in the United States. 49. America, the only really protectionist state. The policy has failed, and a new era is beginning. 50. In England, on the contrary, we are retracing our steps and returning to protection. 51. The object of this paper to forecast the result of this policy in the two countries. 52. The view of President Cleveland contrasted with that of English politicians. Quotations from his inaugural address and from speeches by Sir William Harcourt, Mr. Arnold Morley, Sir John Gorst, Mr. Campbell Bannerman, Mr. John Burns. 52 to 57. President Cleveland's policy, the beginning of the end of protection. Opinion that this will enable us to compete successfully with American manufacturers entirely erroneous. The reduction of cost of production in America will for the first time make their competition formidable to U.S. 58. Some of the conditions of English. An American manufacturer considered 59 American high wages under present conditions. Exaggerated. Probability that with free trade they will rise and take from us our skilled labor. 62. The change of policy in America to synopsis of contents. X 111. Be regarded with equanimity if we, Mr. John Burns' admission of the we're adhering to free trade. 64. Hopelessness of labor protection. Still we are in possession only our 75. Own criminal folly can rob us of impossibility of walling. In a country at 65, or a trade without ruin to its best looking at home, there is much to interest. 76. Disquiet U.S. politicians doling out expectation that wages will advance protection to secure votes. Policy in a free market justified by experiemer. Bright and Lord Shaftesbury. And 76. Compared 67. Necessity of a policy of retrenchment. Chamberlain reintroduces proment. Burden of war preparations. Protection under the alias of construct and foreign policy. The enviable tie of legislation. Mr. Burns on position of America. 78. Reproductive work. 69. Position of the colonies. 80. Skepticism of socialists or protect the problem before a nation depend. Sheenists as to progress, as illustrated dent like England on foreign trade by state pension proposals. 71. Necessity for economical public American protection. An object lesson. Administration. 81. A corrupt policy of give, with a market set free from the dread of burden falling ultimately on agro-labor troubles and the burden of cultural class, and in the end, vexatious taxation would retain rail exasperation and collapse. 72% capital buried in hopeless enter in England. The burden is to be put prizes in Argentina, Africa, and on the capitalist class, with the elsewhere 82 result that capital will be destroyed. President Cleveland and Sir William, or forced to emigrate. 74. Harcourt, typical of the views of Mr. Chamberlain, fears the competition their countrymen. Summary of a free trade Ireland, but not of the situation. 83. For free trade America. 74. Hope expressed that we may be. American labor troubles, protests warned in time by the obviousness. Against artificial or protective of the danger. 84% monopoly. 75. 3. National workshops. First, socialistic theories of nationaliza, Sion and municipalization to be tested by facts. 87. The national workshops of 1848. An experiment in this direction. 88. Hence their importance and relevancy in any consideration of socialistic principles. 88. Second, the national workshops, a deliberate and bona fide attempt to put socialistic principles in practice. 89. As proved by the text of the decree. 89. 3. Louis Blanc, a convinced socialist at the head of the experiment. The superintendents entrusted to Emile Thomas, a practical man of business, though not a socialist. 90. Louis Blanc armed with practically absolute powers. 94th. Text of decrees formulating the droit du travail en ateliers nationaux. 91 v. The organization described. 92 zix. The evidence of the correspondent of the economist. 93. Mr. Nassau Sr. describes the work as an exact counterpart of the parish farm. 94. Evidence of Victor Hugo and of Emile Thomas. 94. The result insurrection, street fight, ing, and 12,000 men shot in the streets. 95. 7th. Thiers on another experiment in collectivism. 96. Report of surveyor on work of employed at Millbank. 97. 8th. English experience of parish farms, and under old poor law, very similar, 98. Ninth, two solutions offered, that of the socialists and that of the advocates of free exchange, 99x, a plain summary of the case. Against socialism, IOI. 4. State socialism and the collapse in Australia. Dr. Pearson's national character due to the inspiration of Australia, 105, his account of Australian state socialism. 105, 106, its alleged success in Australia, the assumption that it is inevitable elsewhere, 106, 107, the religion of the state as outlined. By Dr. Pearson, it promises great good, but demands proportional sacrifices. It is omnipotent, it is never inexorable, it bestows benefits freely. Its use of statistics as an advertisement and a liturgy, 108 to 114, the turn of the tide imaginary. Surpluses detected. Statistical. Statement of the course of collapse, 114, 115. Judged by the test of finance. State. Socialism in Australia, a failure, 116. The time has now come to demand. Proportional sacrifices, 117. Will the demand be answered? Earlier example of New Zealand, 118. The exodus of the taxpayer, the absentee debtor. The prayer of the state religion has two clauses: give us our daily bread and forgive us our debts, 119. The case of those who must remain. Considered. The salaried official, the first victims of retrenchments. The public service discouraged, 120. The people on the land, being unorganized, their share of pillage has been less than that of the town dwellers, and their burden from protective tariffs more oppressive on them. The bill for proportional sacrifices now falls 121, 122, and awkward and disagreeable. Awakening for the agricultural class, the true workers of the colony, their natural resentment at garbled accounts, delusive assertions as to reproductive public works, laborers diverted from agricultural industry by artificial work in the towns by means of borrowed money, 123, 124. The state in its perplexity has recourse to various doubtful financial expedients, 124. Conclusion that, financially, state socialism has failed, benefits have been squandered, and the obligations of the taxpayer strained to the verge of repudiation. New oppressive and arbitrary taxation has been imposed on the industrious, gambling has been encouraged, and a low tone of commercial morality has grown up, 125 to 128. The ethics of public life, too, have suffered. The Adventures of Sir G. Dibbs, 129. The decay of parental authority under the educational policy of the state, 130. Synopsis of contents, 15th. State socialism has corrupted the national character, a fact all the more lamentable in view of the nobler early traditions of the country and of the necessity of basing recuperation on national character, 132. The prospects of state socialism elsewhere. In Australia, it has been carried out at the expense of the British capitalist in Europe. It must be based on the taxation of the successful, 134. Can the system endure? It can make beggars, but not one millionaire, and must end in bankruptcy. Then comes a revulsion of feeling when it is too late. 137. Yet it seems inevitable that state socialism will come and be the death cry of our civilization, 139. Fifth, the influence of state borrowing on commercial crises. Commercial crisis, a general definity on 145, certain well-marked characteristics. To be further described, 145, inflation and collapse, followed by long period of inactivity and liquidation, 146. The peculiar position of the banker, who, unlike other traders, is always a debtor, on balance, his need for careful choice of securities, 147. The Buenos Aires waterworks, and the Barings. The collapse due to the rash engagements of the firm, and the refusal of the investing public to support it, 149. The Baring and Overend catastrophes. Compared. Popular belief in the ability of foreign governments to create productive works, the cause of much ill-considered lending, 150. There will always be speculation. The security of a well-planned industrial undertaking better than the security based on excessive taxation. Abuse of state guarantee, 151. The tendency of politicians to find excuse for extending the sphere of state action. From 1820 to 1870, the country was freeing itself from many mischievous forms of state interference. The present reaction not yet gone very far, 152. The present inquiry confined to the financial consequences of this policy. Method of raising capital in London market, 153. The case of a foreign or colonial government raising a loan for productive public work. The inflation of trade, the demand artificially created ceases. The illustration of Argentina, 154. Natural that Great Britain should Advance capital to new countries. Objection to this being done through government loans. 155 Greater safety of a more gradual development through the application of capital by private enter. Prize 156 argument that instruments of production should be in hands of government involves a mistaken view of functions of government. Young countries may try experiments, but the fact of their youth will not prevent failure. 157. The capitalists of Great Britain, the principal creditors of the world. A breakdown in any one country, therefore, alarms and paralyzes credit all over the world. 158. Summary of reasons why government issuing finance houses combined to borrowings are more likely to draw make a certain danger. Thipermus countries into difficulty than of a government not always a good vate borrowings. 1. Government guarantee. 159 borrows more than necessary. 2. Economic objection to loans at home. The money does not go so far. 3. To enable government to carry on its credit, depending on the taxation public works, 1 or 2 instances. Of its subjects being greater, it's mentioned 160 power to throw good money after conclusion, that the present 10 bad much less limited, hence density 2. Increase the interference chance of larger collapse, 159% of government, in matters relating to ready belief of borrowers of their to trade and commerce ought to be. Ability to pay, and carelessness of diminished 161. Sexta. The state in relation to railways. The relation of the state to railways may take one of 5 forms. 165. 2 forms may at once be excluded. 165. A third, viz. State ownership of railways which are let out to be worked by private enterprise, now out of fashion in this country, though favored at one time by Sir Rowland Hill, adopted in Italy, in Holland, and in a sense in France. 166. In England, there are left 2 possible methods: state ownership and private ownership under state control. 166. Wide ramifications of the subject. 167 objections alleged against our present system considered and answered: waste of competition, bloated dividends, a tax on trade, unwillingness to make concessions, granting of undue preference, occasional effete or incompetent management. 168 to 171. Arguments in favor of state ownership considered and appreciated. State should own monopolies, economy and rate of interest on capital due to superior credit of state also. Due to unification of management, state would work railways for the benefit of community. 171 to 173. Would-be reformers unable to agree as to principle on which rates are to be based. 173. The matter not to be decided by a priori arguments, but by observation of practical experiment. Some of the state-managed railways of the continent, the worst in the world. Railways of Baden, Belgium, Prussia, Australia, 174 to 179. The results summed up: 1. State management does not reduce the price of services. 2. Management more costly. 3. Endanger of political corruption. Great. 179. State management of post office criticized. 180 to 185. Admitting that state railways are undesirable, the limits and occasions of state control have next to be considered under 2 heads: 1. As affecting public safety. 2. As regulating tariffs. 186. The first of these turns on the interpretation in each case of the old maxim: sic utere tuo ut alienum non laedas. Construction of new lines, compulsory dispossession of owners, promoters to show that they have sufficient prospect of financial support, publicity of accounts, level crossings, signaling, interlocking, and 186 a 190. Synopsis of contents. Cint. The crucial point, however, is tariff regulation, necessary within certain limits. 191. Justification of state control considered on the ground that a railway is a monopoly, that it has acquired property by compulsory powers, that the authorizing act of Parliament secured, by way of bargain, certain advantages to the public. 192 to 195, hence maximum rates. Their futility. As a means of securing free contract and equality of charges, difficulty of applying the principle. 195. The controversy as to what constitutes undue preference considered. 196. Personal discriminations unknown. In England, discriminations favoring special classes of goods in special localities frequent. 197. The difficulties to be overcome by any tribunal for the regulation of rates. 198 to 203. Conclusion that the authority of the executive cannot beneficially undertake much more than purveying information. Mr. Justice Wills on the danger of ill-considered innovations. 203. Experience in this country and in The United States confirmed these. Views 204 satisfactory result of publicity in Massachusetts 205 summary of results. State owner, ship undesirable. State control, unavoidable. General conclusion in favor of the present system. With publicity, the eventual supremacy of an enlightened public opinion is matter of certainty. On this we must rely. 207 to 210. 7. The interest of the working class in free exchange, the property of a man in his own one. Labor the poor man's most. Person, the origin and foundation, important possession. 217% of all other property. 213 general functions of a market. The as necessary corollary from this labor market contrasted with the follows the right of the free gold market. The appreciation of change of labor and of the wages gold doubtful. The appreciation of oath labor. 213. Labor obvious and certain. Free. No need to discuss questions of pre-mintage means a continuous historic title. Modern title to manned for gold. Free exchange has. Property rests on legal acts of a similar function to perform for exchange. 214. Labor. 218. The influence of free exchange in the Malthusian fallacy that subsist economic organization of society hence is limited, is analogous to the limited but still operative civilly trade unionist fallacy that opposition means the extension of that. Unities for labor are limited. 219. Influence. 215. How far at present is free exchange the purpose of the paper to consider acting as a free mintage for labor? The influence of free exchange is 219. It affects the property, which the mobility of labor, considered labor, has. 1. In his own labor, some comfort to be found in pro. 2. In his own savings, 217 gress already made. 220. B. Extiate. Synopsis of contents. The wages of domestic service cited argument that free exchange and the bargain in detail have been beneficial and a cause of rising wages. 222. The modern trade unionist blind to the advantages of free exchange. 223. His objections considered argument that better conditions of labor must come from an increase of exchangeable supply, i.e., the increased production of the proper things in their proper quantities and places. 224. This economical distribution of effort, that is labor and capital, to be effected only by free exchange. 225. Injustice and inexpediency of a compulsory minimum wage, the cause of the congestion of labor, known as the unemployed problem. 226. Doubt expressed whether this coercive policy is conducive to the main object of trade unionism. 227. Other forms of restriction on free exchange, municipal trading, larger forms of enterprise claimed as the monopoly of government, consequent congestion of capital and labor in the smaller industries. 227. The terms employable and competent considered. Free exchange, the necessary condition of the growth of these characteristics. 228. The art of capitalization, a form of exchange, the coping stone of industrial competence. 230. Savings, a cause of firmness in the labor market, contrasted with poor law relief, which has an opposite effect. 2312. The property of the poor man. In his Benefit Society and Savings Bank, considered. 232. Argument that saving is a process of exchange. 232. A logical nature of the socialists. Dissent from a particular form of exchange. 233. The savings of the working class A. Practical refutation of collectivism. 235. Question of savings banks. Comparison. Instituted between government savings banks, commercial banks on the Scotch system, and cooperative banks in Germany and elsewhere. 236. A sound system of credit developed by banks compared to the fertilizing waters of the Nile. 237. Argument that these advantages can be secured to the laborer by cooperative banking. 238. 239. Improvement in working class insurance under free competition. 241. Controversy in the cooperative movement between advocates of dividend on purchase and dividend on wages. 243. A neglected element in the cooperative theory. The most satisfactory cooperation is the subdivision and distribution of capital and labor in a free market. 245 millions. Rostand's comparison of the sterile antagonism of LaSalle to the constructive beneficence of the life work of one of our English cooperative worthies. 248. 8. The principle of progression in taxation. Two theories stated as to the legiti. 2. For bringing about an equalizer. Made purposes of taxation. 251. Scion of incomes. 252. 1. For the sake of revenue nesses. Desire for economy now less powerful. Seri for economical administra than before. Hence, new scheme scion of public services. 251. For raising revenue, among others. Synopsis of contents. Zix. Progressive or graduated taxa. Admitting the justice of principle, Qian 252 other considerations to be taken a preliminary question. What are into account? 1. Variability of term. The legitimate purposes of taxa luxuries is between different shan, 253 classes of men in different times, if theory, 1, as above prevails, there, 2, a satisfaction of a primary want, will be no burdensome taxation for, a step upward in the path of civility, any class, if theory, 2, be to anyzation, 3, free exchange daily extent adopted, then progressive. Bringing within the reach of the taxation may become a formidable million, what were formerly the weapon 253 luxuries of the great 200. And 61. This preliminary question, not here these considerations, pointing to the considered 253 beneficence and leveling influence object of paper to discuss 1. The of wealth accumulating under a abstract principle of progression, system of free exchange, suggest 2. Its practical value as a method, the necessity of a limit to the of taxation 253 principle of progression. 264 taxation to be levied. 1. In proportion description of the nature of this. To benefits enjoyed, or 2, according limit 265, to ability to pay 254, can an equitable rate of graduation, this last the view of Mill. Equality be fixed? 265. Of sacrifice not realized when? Justice of the exemption of the lower. Necessities of life were taxed, hence incomes 265 taxation of luxuries. A tax levy difficulty of fixing the scale of graduate property and income to some stand for the higher incomes 266. Extent of recognition of the principle next. Is graduation satisfactory in of graduation 254? 255 practice? 267 its indirect recognition in this count M. Leroy Beaulieu in favor of A. Try its popularity with the demo light and uniform tax 267 Cracy 255 Mr. Goshen and M. Leroy Beaulieu. The question therefore presses and quoted to show how large a proportion deserves attention. 256 son of the national income of Mill argues that the same percent civilized countries is in the hands. Tage does not ensure equality of small proprietors. 267, 268 sacrifice recommends exemption unproductive nature of progressive of smaller incomes, but rejects taxation if excessive. It tends to graduation. 256 defeat its object if moderate. Little Mill's conclusions. Unsatisfactory. 257 more productive than uniform, or the subject viewed from the stand proportional taxation. 269. Point of Javan's theory, the both fears and hopes with regard to distinction between utility and this principle of taxation acts of value. Statement of this theory, jurated. If used for equalizing and a justification of the print taxation, and not for equalizing sample of progression based thereon incomes, a useful adjunct to 257, taxation, 273. Synopsis of contents. 9. The law of trade combinations. Growth of combination in modern Lawson, of Curran versus Treleaven, Commerce, 277. Conclusion that the statute of 1875 large companies and trusts press on leaves a very absolute power in the individual trader as trade hands of trade combinations. Unions due on the individual work, 279 to 284 man, 277. B. The criminal law as defensive. The common law of conspiracy. Necessity of preventing physical its scope and authority considered. Violence, 278 possibility of its application in the early laws against combination. Now case of Gibson v. Lawson, the X out of harmony with modern emption contained in section 3 of ideas 278. The statute 1875 considered. The scope of the article to discuss 285 to 287. The question as affected, I, by the remedy of the civil law, the criminal law, and 2, by the Mogul Steamship Company versus civil law. 279 mega coulombs Gregor, Gow and Company. The case of A, the criminal law as laid down in Temperton v. Russell, 287 to 289. The conspiracy and protection of the decisions in these two cases, Crown Property Act 1875, the effect of trasted, suggestion that they are this statute. Sections 3 and 7 not governed by the same rule, quoted ambiguity of term, intimate probability that they will either date, its analogy with the corrupt be more clearly distinguished or practices. Act 1883, intimidation the decision in one or other reaccording. To Mr. Justice Cave must verse 290, 290. 1 include the threat of personal summary, 292 violence. The case of Gibson v. Erste on the science of economics and its relation to free exchange and socialism. Henry Dunning, MacLeod, D. Me. Erste on the science of economics and its relation to free exchange and socialism. All persons who are interested in the so-called science of economics know only too well the melancholy and deplorable state into which it has fallen. It is such a chaos of contradictions that very many persons refuse to believe that there is any such science at all. 1. The cause of this lamentable confusion is that there are fundamental concepts of it, which are wholly irreconcilable with each other, just as there have been in the earlier and imperfect stages of most other sciences, such as astronomy, optics, and many others. A science is a body of phenomena, all relating to a single fundamental general concept. Thus, dynamics is the science which treats of the laws governing the phenomena of force. Optics is the science of the laws governing the phenomena of. In 1870, Stanley Jevons, after Tavol. Two of my theory and practice having read my works, then pub of banking, we have no hesitation lished, as he is very handsomely in saying that the whole system of acknowledged in his preface spoke of political economy, as laid down by political economy as the shattered Ricardo and developed by Mr. John Science, an expression which has Stuart Mill, is utterly and radically acquired a certain popular vogue. Bad, which gave prodigious offense long previous to this in 1856 at the time. I also said, the time when I had occasion to study the has come when all political economy works on economics, then current must be rewritten. After 30. In their relation to credit and 8 years people are beginning to banking, I had pointed out their debt, find out that this is true, Fex, and said, in the introduction. B2. A policy of free exchange. 1. Light, and so on. Economics is often said to be the science of wealth. What then is wealth? What is that quality of things which constitutes them wealth? Economies can only be the science of the laws which govern the phenomena relating to that quality which constitutes things wealth. It was long an assured opinion in this country that Adam Smith was the founder and creator of political economy and free trade. A once prominent politician is reported to have said that political economy and free trade sprang perfect and complete from the brain of Adam Smith, as Minerva did from the head of Jupiter. Such ideas, however, show a complete ignorance of the history of economics and are now quite abandoned by all persons who have studied the subject. In fact, it is contrary to nature that it should be so. Great sciences are not created by a book. Invariably arise from small beginnings, just as the mighty Danube flows from a spring in the garden of a German burgher. Men begin to observe certain phenomena connected with some single general fundamental concept. Then others extend it to a larger number of phenomena based on the same concept, and so at last, by the contributions of an increasing number of observers, it grows into a great science, just as the Danube from a tiny spring is swollen into a mighty river by multitudes of tributary streams. Everyone with a scientific instinct can at once perceive that Adam Smith's work is pervaded by a combative air, that every part of it is evidently written at something preceding, and that it was intended to overthrow a prior system. As a matter of fact, economics was founded as a science by an illustrious sect of philosophers in France in the middle of the last century, who were the first to perceive and declare that there is a positive and definite science of economics based upon demonstrative reasoning in the same way as the physical sciences. The science of economics, like medicine, has arisen out of the calamities and misery of mankind, caused by the violation of true economic principles, and every advance in economic theory has originated in some great pressing practical evil. 1. The science of economics. The first department of economics to be reduced to scientific principles was that of money. Charlemagne caused the pound weight of silver to be adopted as the standard of money in all Western Europe, and he divided it into 240 pennies. The medieval sovereigns clipped, curtailed, and debased their coinages, but declared that the clipped and debased coin should pass at the same value as good coin. Philip le Bel was particularly conspicuous for issuing debased coin, for which he was consigned to the Inferno by Dante. This degradation of the coin produced such intolerable evils and misery to the people that Charles V of France referred the matter to one of his counselors, Nicolas Oresme, who addressed to him a treatise on money, which may be said to stand at the head of modern economics. In consequence of similar evils in Poland, Sigismund I requested Copernicus to draw up a treatise on the subject. This has recently been discovered and printed in the new edition of his works. These two treatises lay down the true principles of money, which are now accepted by all sound economists. For many centuries, all governments enacted laws regarding trade without suspecting that there are any fixed principles on the subject. Sometimes they favored free trade, sometimes protection, sometimes they cockered up one species of industry, sometimes another, according to the whim of the moment. They never seem to have had the faintest idea that the true principle was to leave every industry alone and allow each one to develop itself according to its natural tendencies. Everyone has heard of the glories of the reign of Louis XIV, but few probably have any idea of the terrible reaction and the incredible disasters and misery of the end of his reign. These may be learnt from contemporary writers and also from Taine's History of the Ancient Regime. Soon after the death of Louis XIV, John Law was allowed to try in France his scheme of paper money, which had been previously rejected by the Scottish Parliament. The result was that disastrous catastrophe known by the name of the Mississippi Scheme. In 1749, Turgot, then a young man of Cest, a policy of free exchange, 22, began to reflect upon these terrible calamities and endeavored to discover the error of Law's system. Turgot associated with himself Gourlet, an eminent merchant who was a keen advocate of free trade; Quesnay, the king's physician; Latrosne, Mirabeau Père, the Abbé Baudot, and many others, who formed themselves into a powerful sect under the name of the economists. These men were the first to perceive and declare that there is a positive and definite science which may be named economics. They found France divided into a number of separate and semi-independent provinces, each of them surrounded with custom houses, which were an intolerable barrier to commercial intercourse. Every species of industry was loaded with minute and oppressive regulations. A very large portion of the human race was groaning under the bonds of slavery. In every country, persons were relentlessly persecuted for their religious opinions. The economists held that these commercial, personal, and religious oppressions were contrary to the fundamental rights of mankind. They proclaimed as the indefeasible natural rights of mankind the freedom of person, the freedom of opinion, and the freedom of exchange or of commerce. Quesnay, who was the real founder of the science, and his followers, reflecting on the intolerable misery they saw around them, struck out the idea that there must be some great natural science, some principles of eternal truth, founded on nature itself, with regard to the social relations of mankind, the violation of which was the cause of the hideous misery of their native land. The name Quesnay first gave to it was natural right, and his object was to discover and lay down an abstract science of the natural rights of men in all their social relations. This science comprehended their relations towards the government, towards each other, and towards property. The term politique in French might in a certain way have expressed this science, but the word was so exclusively appropriated to the art of government that they adopted for it the name political economy or economical philosophy, and hence they were named. 1. The science of economics. The economists. Dupont de Nemours, one of their number, proposed the name of physiocratie, or the government of the nature of things, and hence they were often called the physiocrates, but the word, having been appropriated to certain doctrines of the sect which are now shown to be erroneous and abandoned by all subsequent economists of note, has fallen into disuse, and the term political economy, or economics, which is now more commonly used, has survived. Now it is evident that this wide and extensive scheme comprehends not only a single science, but a whole multitude of sciences, and we shall henceforth confine ourselves strictly to that part of it which relates to commerce or exchanges. Quesnay's first publication, Le Droit Naturel, contains a general inquiry into these natural rights, and he afterwards, in another work called Maximes Générales du Gouvernement économique d'un royaume agricole, endeavored to lay down, in a series of 30 maxims or general principles, the whole basis of the economy of society. The 23rd of these declares that a nation suffers no loss by trading with foreigners. The 24th declares the fallacy of the balance of trade. The 25th says, let entire freedom of commerce be maintained for the regulation of commerce, both internal and external. The most sure, the most exact, the most profitable to the nation and to the state consists in entire freedom of competition. These maxims entirely overthrew the prevailing system of political economy. This was the work of Quesnay and his followers, and notwithstanding certain errors and shortcomings mentioned below, they are unquestionably entitled to be acknowledged as the founders of political economy and free trade. We may now give a brief abstract of the doctrine of the economists, by which they vindicated the principle of liberty and the right of property. The Creator has placed man upon the earth with the evident intention that the race should prosper, and there are certain physical and moral laws which conduce in the highest degree to ensure its preservation, increase, well-being, and osem, a policy of free exchange. 1. Improvement. The correlation between these physical and moral laws is so close that if either be misunderstood, through ignorance or passion, the others are also. Physical nature, or matter, bears to mankind very much the relation which the body does to the mind. Hence the perpetual and necessary relation of physical and moral good and evil to each other. Natural justice is the conformity of human laws and actions to natural order, and this collection of physical and moral laws existed before any positive institutions among men. And while their observance produces the highest degree of prosperity and well-being among men, the non-observance or transgression of them is the cause of the extensive physical evils which afflict mankind. If such a natural order exists, our intelligence is capable of understanding it, for if not, it would be useless, and the sagacity of the Creator would be at fault. As, therefore, these laws are instituted by the Supreme Being, all men and all states ought to be governed by them. They are immutable and irrefragable, and the best possible laws. They are necessarily the basis of the most perfect government, and the fundamental rule of all positive laws, which are only for the purpose of upholding that natural order which is evidently the most advantageous for the human race. The evident object of the Creator being the preservation, the increase, the well-being, and the improvement of the race, man necessarily received from his origin not only intelligence, but instincts conformable to that end. Every one feels himself endowed with the triple instincts of well-being, sociability, and justice. He understands that the isolation of the brute is not suitable to his double nature, and that his physical and moral wants urge him to live in the society of his equals, in a state of peace, goodwill, and concord. He also recognizes that other men having the same wants as himself, cannot have less rights than himself, and therefore he is bound to respect their right so that other men may observe a similar obligation towards him. These three ideas, the necessity of work, the necessity of society, and the necessity of justice, imply three others. 1. The science of economics. Liberty, property, and authority, which are the three essential terms of all social order. How could man understand the necessity of labor or obey the irresistible instinct of self-preservation without perceiving at the same time that the instrument of labor, the physical and intellectual qualities with which he is endowed by nature, belong exclusively to himself, that he is master and the absolute proprietor of his own person, that he is born and should remain free? But the idea of liberty cannot spring up in the mind without associating with it that of property, in the absence of which the first would only represent an illusory right without an object. The freedom the individual has of acquiring useful things by labor includes necessarily the right of preserving them, of enjoying them, and of disposing of them without reserve, and also of bequeathing them to his family, who prolong his existence indefinitely. Thus, liberty conceived in this manner involves and is dependent on the idea of property, which may be conceived in two aspects, as it regards movable goods, and as it regards the earth, which is the source from which labor ought to draw them. At first, property was principally movable, but when the cultivation of the earth was necessary for the preservation, increase, and improvement of the race, individual appropriation of the soil became necessary, because no other system is so proper to draw from the earth all the massive utilities it can produce, and secondly, because collective property would have produced many inconveniences as to the sharing of the fruits, which would not arise from the division of the land, by which the rights of each are fixed in a clear and definite manner. Property in land is therefore the necessary and legitimate consequence of the principle of personal and movable property. Every man has therefore centered in him by the laws of providence certain rights and duties, the right of enjoying himself to the utmost of his capacity, and the duty of respecting similar rights in others. This perfect protection of reciprocal rights and duties conduces to production in the highest degree, as well as to the greatest, a policy of free exchange. Amount of physical enjoyments. Thus, the economists established freedom and property as the fundamental right of mankind, freedom of person, freedom of opinion, freedom of exchange or commerce, and the violation of these they maintain to be contrary to the laws of providence, and therefore the cause of all evil to men. We must now examine what their doctrines were regarding exchanges or commerce. While they expressly declared that exchanges or commerce were one of the departments of economical philosophy, they most unfortunately devised another and alternative name for it, which being misinterpreted by a subsequent very distinguished French writer, has been the cause of all the mischief and confusion of the science in recent times. They termed the department of economical philosophy relating to exchanges or commerce the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth. It might not be very apparent to the general reader how in the mind of the economists these two concepts are identical and meant exactly the same thing, and we must now explain the interpretation of this latter expression given to it by its authors. They define the word wealth to mean the material products of the earth which are brought into commerce and exchanged, and those only. The products of the earth, which were consumed by their owners without an exchange, they termed biens, but not richesse. They steadfastly refuse to admit that labor and credit are wealth because they allege that this was to allow that wealth can be created out of nothing. They constantly maintained that man can create nothing, and that ex nihilo nihil fit. By production, they meant obtaining the rude produce from the earth and bringing it into commerce. But this rude produce is scarcely ever fit to be used by men. It has to be fashioned and manufactured in a multitude of ways to be transported from place to place, and perhaps sold and resold more than once before it is ultimately purchased for use and enjoyment. All these intermediate operations of manufacture, transport, 1. The science of economics, and sale between the original producer and the ultimate purchaser, the economists termed traffic, or distribution. The final purchaser who bought the product for his own use and enjoyment, and so took it out of commerce, they termed the acheteur-consommateur, because he consummated, or completed, the operation. Consummation, in the language of the economists and of all French writers before them, meant simply purchase or demand. It involved no idea of destruction. The consommateur, or consumer, was the person for whose benefit all the preceding operations took place. Production was only for the sake of consumption, or demand. And consumption, or demand, was the measure of reproduction, because products which remain without consumption, or demand, degenerate into superfluities without value. The complete passage of a product from the original producer to the ultimate consumer, or purchaser, through all its intermediate stages, the economists termed commerce, or an exchange, and as any man who wished to consume or purchase any product must have some product of his own to give in exchange for it, he was also a producer in his turn. Hence, in an exchange, things are produced and consumed or purchased on each side. An exchange has only two essential terms, a producer or seller and a consumer or purchaser. These are the only two persons necessary to commerce, and they often exchange directly between themselves without any intermediate agents. Hence, the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth, as defined by the economists, meant simply the commerce or the exchange of the material products of the earth, and of these only. But distribution was often used as synonymous with consumption. Hence, production, distribution, and consumption, production and distribution, and production and consumption all meant exactly the same thing, the commerce or exchange of the material products of the earth. It must be carefully observed that these expressions were one and indivisible, and they must not be separated into a policy of free exchange. 1. Component terms. They all meant simply supply and demand. The economists, by restricting the term wealth to the material products of the earth, made materiality and labor the accessories or accidents of wealth, but they did not make them the principle or essence of wealth. The essence or principle of wealth they held to consist in exchangeability, because they expressly excluded the material products of the earth which were not brought into commerce and exchanged from the term wealth. Now, considering that the economists admitted and declared that there is a positive and definite science of exchanges or commerce, how is it possible to restrict it to the commerce or exchanges of material products only? It must evidently and necessarily comprehend all exchanges, or all commerce, in its widest extent and in all its various forms. There is a gigantic commerce in labor. There is a colossal commerce in rights and rights of action, credits, or debts. How is it possible to exclude the commerce in labor and the commerce in rights and rights of action from the general science of exchanges, or commerce? The basis of the science of economics is the meaning or definition of the term wealth. The economists admitted that exchangeability is the real essence of wealth, but they clogged it with the limitation that it only applied to material products and denied it to labor and credit, which equally possess the quality of exchangeability. But this is contrary to the fundamental principles of natural philosophy. Bacon long ago pointed out that when the quality or the concept which is at the basis of a science is once determined, all quantities whatsoever which possess that quality, however diverse in form they may be, must be included among the elements or constituents of the science. This is what Plato calls the one and the many, i.e., the same quality appearing in many different forms. It would be just as rational to restrict the term force to the force of men and animals, and to exclude gravitation from the term force. Ancient writers for 1,300 years unanimously held that 1. The science of economics. Trinact. Exchangeability, pure and simple, is the sole essence and principle of wealth. That everything which can be bought and sold or exchanged is wealth, whatever its nature or its form may be. Aristotle defined wealth to be all things whose value can be measured in money. Here we have a fundamental concept of the widest generality and fitted to form the basis of a great science. Out of this single sentence of Aristotle, the whole science of economics is to be evolved, just as the great oak is developed out of a tiny acorn. In an ancient anonymous dialogue, Socrates is made to show that money is only wealth where and when it can be exchanged or purchase other things. Where it cannot be exchanged or purchase other things, it is not wealth. He shows that anything which can be exchanged for or purchase other things like money is wealth, for just the same reason. He says that persons gain their living by giving instruction in the sciences. Therefore, he says, the sciences are wealth alphi, epi sigma tawitamu alphiota, chirho emu alpha omicro nu sigma alphiota, and that those who possess them are wealthier pilamda omicron epsilon sigmaiota auta epsilon rumcroni epsilon sigmaiota. This is the first recognition, of which I am aware, that labor is wealth. Demosthenes showed that personal credit is wealth because a merchant can purchase goods with his credit equally as with money. The Roman jurists showed that rights and rights of action, such as credits or debts, are wealth because they can be bought and sold. Thus, after 800 years from the time of Aristotle, the Roman jurists completed the science because they completed the number of its constituent elements. There is nothing which can be bought and sold or exchanged, or whose value can be measured in money, which is not of one of these three forms or orders of quantities. 1. Material products. 2. Personal qualities, i.e. labor, which can be exchanged for wages, and character, which may entitle to credit, and 3. Abstract rights. There is no trace in ancient writers of any such doctrine as that labor and materiality are necessary to wealth and value. Thus they answered 2,100 years ago the doctrine of a policy of free exchange. 1. The economists that labor is necessary to wealth, because they declare that personal qualities and abstract rights are wealth, and they recognize 3 orders of economic quantities. These can be exchanged against one another in 6 different ways, and these 6 different kinds of exchange constitute commerce in its widest extent and in all its forms and varieties. The relation of these quantities to each other is termed their value, and the laws of natural philosophy show that there can be only one general law of value, or a single general equation of economics. We have thus a definite body of phenomena, all based upon a single general concept, separate and distinct from all other phenomena, and circumscribed by a definition, which constitutes a science and may be designated as pure or analytical economics. Thus, if anyone had conceived the idea of describing the mechanism of these exchanges, or of commerce, economics might have been the eldest born of all the sciences. But there was no science in existence in those days to serve as a model for the creation of a science of economics, and a long and dreary interval had to elapse before the moderns reached the perfection of the ancients, all to redound to the immortal glory of Bacon, who was the first to point out that the physical sciences must first be created to serve as models before it is possible to create the sciences of society. For many centuries, it was held that money alone is wealth, and we must briefly state some of the consequences which flowed from this doctrine, which produced innumerable wars and other calamities. A strange consequence flowed from the doctrine that only money is wealth. It was held for many centuries that, in an exchange, what one side gained, the other lost. What the persons who maintained this doctrine would have said to an exchange of products, it would be difficult to imagine. They quite forgot that when persons bought things with money, they obtained a satisfaction for their money. Nevertheless, for centuries, the wisest statesmen and philosophers main 1. The science of economics, Patent Act, maintained that in commerce, what one side gained, the other lost. They held that foreign commerce which did not produce an importation of money was a loss to the nation. Accordingly, in every country, laws were made to encourage the importation of money and to prohibit its export. This doctrine was the cause of innumerable wars. J.B. Say, writing in the first quarter of the century, says that during the last 300 years, 50 had been spent in wars directly arising out of the dogma that money alone is wealth. About the end of the 17th century, it began to be perceived that it was absurd to maintain that money alone is wealth, and the term was enlarged to include all the material products of the earth which conduce to man's subsistence and enjoyment. But still they held to the doctrine of the balance of trade, which was based on the assumption that, in every transaction of commerce, what one side gained, the other lost. The first merit of the economists was that they entirely overthrew the doctrine of the balance of trade, and they made a considerable advance in economics by maintaining that in commerce neither side gains or loses. The economists maintained that labor engaged in agriculture is the only form of productive labor, because, they alleged, it is the only one in which the value of the produce exceeds the cost of production. The excess of the value of the produce over that of the cost of production they called the produit net, and they maintained that, as this is the only increase of wealth to a country, all taxation should be levied out of the produit net of the agriculturists, and that all other classes should go free. They denied that commerce or manufactures can enrich a nation because, they alleged, in commerce equal values are always exchanged for equal values, and if the values exchanged are always equal, how can there be any profit on either side? They held that the only use of commerce is to vary and multiply the means of enjoyment, but that it does not add to the national wealth, or if it does, it is only by giving a value to the products of the earth which might otherwise fail in finding a market. They contended also that, as all exchanges are merely equal value for equal value, the same principle also applies to sales, and therefore that the gains which traders make are no increase of wealth to the nation. With such views, they held that internal commerce conduces nothing to the wealth of the nation, and foreign commerce very little. They called foreign commerce only a PI's dollar. One very important truth, however, they perceived. They saw that money is the most unprofitable merchandise of any to import, and that merchants never import money when they can import products. Therefore, they called the import of money only the PI's dollar of a PI's dollar. They contended that the labor of artisans in manufactures is sterile or unproductive because, though this labor adds to the value of the product, yet during the process of the manufacture, the laborer consumes his subsistence, and the value added to the product only represents the value of the subsistence destroyed during the labor. Hence, there was a transference of the value of the laborer's subsistence into an equivalent value of another kind, but no production of wealth. They held that all the costs of trafficking come out of the profits of the producers and the consumers, which, though gains to them, are not profit to the nation, and therefore that the state ought not to tax them. All classes of the community, except the agriculturists, they denominated sterile or unproductive. These are the doctrines which the economists maintained, with long and repeated arguments, in defiance of all opposition. But how men of the ability of the economists could maintain that a country cannot be enriched by commerce or manufactures, with the examples of Tyre, Carthage, Venice, Florence, Holland, England, and hosts of others before them, is incomprehensible. With such patent, glaring facts before them, it is surprising that they were not led to suspect the truth of their reasonings. It is one of those aberrations of the human intellect which we can wonder at, but not explain. 1. The science of economics. 17. These doctrines provoked a reaction. Men who were laboring in all sorts of vocations were roused to indignation by being stigmatized as sterile and unproductive. Men were astounded to hear that a nation cannot be enriched by commerce or manufactures. Nevertheless, the doctrines of the economists seemed to be logically unassailable, provided that their fundamental dogma was right. But the consequences they drew from it were so startling and so contrary to patent undeniable facts that clear-sighted men began to inquire. Is it true that in commerce neither side gains? 2 writers entered the field against the economist Condillac in France and Adam Smith in England. Both published their works in the same year, 1776. They overthrew the doctrine that in commerce neither side gains, and maintained that in commerce both sides gain a truth that was seen by anticipation by the great Emperor Frederick II in the 13th century, and by Boiseau, the morning star of economics, in the beginning of the 18th century. In this brief sketch, we have no space to say much about Condillac because his explanation is not very satisfactory, and his work never attracted the slightest attention till very recently. This, then, was the real origin of Adam Smith's work. He was neither the founder and creator of economics nor of free trade. Economics, as a science, sprang out of the misery and calamities of the French people, and the economists were the first to perceive and declare that there is a positive and definite science of economics, and that, consequently, it must be constructed by exactly the same methods by which all other sciences have been created, namely, by settling its fundamental general concepts and definitions, by a strictly accurate statement of facts and phenomena, and by reducing all the phenomena to a single general law. Economics is the science of exchanges, or of commerce, and therefore the details of commerce are the phenomena of economics. Nor was Adam Smith the founder of free trade. The economists published their code of Osmnacht, a policy of free exchange. 1. Doctrine in 1759, in which free exchange was asserted to be one of the fundamental rights of mankind, and there were numerous and powerful advocates of free trade in Italy and Spain 15 years before Adam Smith published a line. Turgot carried out immense reforms in the direction of free trade in 1774. How did these writers and statesmen learn the doctrines of free trade from Adam Smith when his work was not published till 1776? The fact is that Adam Smith did not attempt to disprove the theory of protection and prohibition. He assumed free trade as the doctrine approved of by all enlightened minds. Adam Smith has done sufficient services himself to economics, and his reputation does not require the advances and services done by other persons to be attributed to him. Adam Smith then attacked the doctrine of the economists, that in commerce neither side gains or loses, by a course of masterly reasoning far superior to that of Condillac, but too long to be set out here. He demonstrated that in commerce both sides gain, and therefore that nations, in multiplying their commercial relations, multiply their profits and multiply wealth. Even if Adam Smith had never done anything else for economics than this, he would have been entitled to immortal glory. By this single demonstration, he brought about a change in public opinion and in international policy, which has forever removed a perennial source of war from the world. Nations learned that instead of destroying each other and trying to ruin each other's commerce, it was their interest to promote each other's prosperity and to multiply their commercial relations with each other. Adam Smith next proceeded to demolish the doctrine that neither commerce nor manufactures enrich a nation. He demonstrated that both commerce and manufactures are productive of wealth and enrich a nation. Furthermore, he burst the bonds of the narrow dogmatism of the economists, that the material products of the earth alone are wealth. For under the title of fixed capital, he includes the natural and acquired abilities of the people, and under the title of circulating capital, he includes bank. 1. The science of economics. De Wetenacht, notes, bills of exchange, ANSI, which are mere abstract rights or credit, and types of vast masses of other incorporeal property. Hence, he fully recognized the existence of the three orders of economic quantities, as the ancients had done. But the utility of his work is sadly marred by the total want of clear, distinct, and uniform fundamental concepts or definitions. He entitles his work An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, but he nowhere gives a clear and distinct definition of what wealth is. In the introduction, he says that the real wealth of a country is the annual produce of land and labor. But he entirely omits exchangeability, which was the quality which the economists, in agreement with the ancients, recognized as the essence of wealth. But Smith's definition is ambiguous. It is not clear whether he means the produce of land and the produce of labor, or the produce of land and labor combined. It is probable that he meant the last, and so he has been generally understood. Now, such a definition is manifestly too wide and also too narrow, because there are multitudes of things which are the produce of land and labor, which are not exchangeable and therefore not wealth. And there are multitudes of things which are exchangeable and therefore have value and are wealth, which are in no way the annual produce of land and labor. Thus, after proceeding some length, he classes the natural and acquired abilities of the people as fixed capital and as national wealth. How are the natural and acquired abilities of the people the annual produce of land and labor? Further on, he classes banknotes, bills of exchange, ANSI, as circulating capital. How are these, which are mere incorporeal rights, the annual produce of land and labor? It is evident that these ideas are absolutely incongruous. This indefiniteness of view we might have shown at much greater length, but these instances are sufficient to prove that his ideas of wealth in different parts of his work are absolutely inconsistent. Furthermore, after inculcating for several hundred pages that value and wealth require the combination of land and a policy of free exchange. 1. Labor. He admits that if a thing is not exchangeable, it is not wealth. He says that if a guinea could not be exchanged for other things, it would not be wealth any more than a bill upon a bankrupt. Thus, after all, he recognizes that exchangeability is the real essence of wealth. By this single sentence, he upsets the whole theory which he had been so elaborately building up. Keen observers have long ago seen that the first half of Adam Smith's work is entirely inconsistent with the latter half, because in the first half, labor is considered as the essence of value and wealth, and in the second half, exchangeability, i.e. demand, is admitted to be the real essence of value and wealth. Ricardo adopted the first half of Adam Smith's doctrine and founds all his ideas of value upon labor. Whately adopted the latter half and adopts exchangeability pure and simple, and says that Adam Smith's title only denotes the subject matter of his work, but that economics is the science of exchanges or of commerce. Adam Smith's first two books are upon production and distribution, but he explains that that means commerce, and he says that his purpose is to examine the causes of the price of things, in other words, the theory of value. And Mackay says in a note that it might be called the science of values. An acute writer pointed out long ago that the great defect of Adam Smith is the total want of unity of doctrine and the want of uniformity of principle. He never had the least idea that the phenomena of value must be reduced to a single general law, but he catches at any theory which seems to explain the cases which for the moment he is considering. The consequence is that his theories are utterly inconsistent with each other, and of course, as they are a series of contradictions, they must sometimes be right. Moreover, though his work abounds with shrewd observations, it is entirely wanting in the very first requisite of every work of science, a clear and accurate definition of its subject matter. Consequently, though Adam Smith did great, and 1. The science of economics. 21. Solid services in overthrowing the prejudices and errors of his own day, his work is in no way fitted as an exposition of the actual science at the present day. In fact, most of the great and complex problems, which are of pressing importance at the present day, had not arisen when he died. Now, from the foundation of economics as a science up to the time of Whately, who was professor at Oxford in 1830, there was in this country a perfect uniformity of opinion as to the general nature of the science. The economists expressly declared that it is the science of exchanges or of commerce or the theory of value, and so it was understood to be by the writers in France who did not enroll themselves. In the sect of the economists by Condillac, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Mackay, Whately, and all persons who were interested in it. And however imperfect it might have been, or however many defects it may have had, these were all capable of being rectified. If this concept had been steadily adhered to, and the same labor had been bestowed upon it to rectify and develop it, by the same methods by which all other sciences have been created, it might long ago have been erected into a positive and definite science, like any of the physical sciences. But most unfortunately, the science was thrown into utter confusion, and its progress retarded for a long time by a distinguished French writer J.B. Say about the beginning of this century. He adopted the second and alternative definition of the science which the economists most unguardedly and unadvisedly suggested. Moreover, he completely changed the meaning of its fundamental terms, by which he ruined economics as a science and has been the cause of all the subsequent confusion and of the deplorable state in which it is at present. From this state of chaos, it has only begun to recover in recent times. Those who have examined the matter closely are beginning to see that the system of J.B. Say is absolutely unworkable as a practical science, and that in order to construct economics as a positive science, it is indispensable to revert to the original concept of it as the science of exchanges or of commerce, a policy of free exchange. While the economists declared that the expression production, distribution, and consumption of wealth is one and indivisible, and meant nothing but exchange or commerce, J.B. Say broke it up into its constituent terms and completely changed their meaning. While the economists defined production to mean bringing the rude produce of the earth into commerce, Say defined it to mean bestowing value on a product. While the economists defined distribution to mean the intermediate operations between production and consumption, and those only, Say treats of distribution in such a nebulous way that it is difficult to make out distinctly what he means by it. The economist and Adam Smith used the word consumption, consummation, to mean purchase pure and simple, or demand. Say defined it to mean the destruction of value, and says that all consumption is a destruction of value. The absurdity of this is patent. When a person purchases, that is, consumes, in the language of the economists and Adam Smith, a diamond ring, a piece of plate, a picture, a statue, or a book, does he thereby destroy them? The fact is that consumption, which Say defined to mean destruction, is no part of economics at all. For economics is limited to the phenomena of exchange. The economists steadfastly refuse to admit that labor and credit are wealth. But on the first page of his work, Say classes titres de créance, banknotes, bills of exchange, the funds, ox, as wealth, and further on includes many other kinds of incorporeal property under the title of wealth. These are all abstract rights. Say also, like Adam Smith, includes all the industrial faculties of the people under the definition of wealth and capital. Now, how can we speak of the production, distribution, and consumption of banknotes, bills of exchange, the funds, shares in commercial companies, copyrights, patents, and the other forms of incorporeal property? How can we speak of the production, distribution, and consumption of labor of different kinds, of knowledge and other intellectual qualities, and of personal credit, whereas we speak of the supply and demand and the 1. The science of economics, triok tivende, value of all these things, and they are all the subjects of exchange or commerce. The whole operations of mercantile, credit, the colossal system of banking, and the foreign exchanges are all sales or exchanges and integral departments of commerce. But how can their mechanism and phenomena be explained under the expression the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth? This separation of the component terms of the expression, production, distribution, and consumption, and their treatment in separate chapters, utterly destroys the character of economics as a science and utterly breaks the back of the theory of value, which is the very essence of economics. Say's books abound in valuable observations, but his system of economics is absolutely unworkable for any practical purposes. Say totally forgot to observe that the expression production, distribution, and consumption of wealth was rigorously restricted by the economists to the exchanges or commerce of material products only, and, even as applied to them, was a very awkward concept, and that labor and credit were entirely excluded from it. But when labor and credit are admitted to be wealth by Adam Smith and Say, and introduced into economics by them, the expression becomes mere unintelligible jargon. J.S. Mill was the friend and pupil of J.B. Say, and modeled his ideas very much on those of Say. Nevertheless, he has considerable divergences from him. He saw that consumption, in the sense of destruction, is no part of economics, and he divides his work into production, distribution, and exchange. But production and distribution, in the language of the economists and Adam Smith, was exchange, so that Mill's work is really simply exchange and exchange. But as the basis of the whole science is the word wealth, we have to see what meaning Mill gives to it. In his preliminary remarks, he says that it is no part of the design of his treatise to aim at metaphysical nicety of definition, where the ideas suggested by a term are already as determinate as practical purposes require, and that everyone has a notion sufficiently correct for common purposes. 24. A policy of free exchange. 1. Of what is meant by wealth. It somewhat surprises us to hear this. For many centuries, nations have been quite unable to agree as to what wealth is, and many bloody wars have been waged because of quarrels which rose directly out of a mistaken conception of its meaning. Vast quantities of mischievous legislation have been enacted as the result of erroneous theories as to its nature and origin, and at the present moment the widest differences of opinion prevail among economists as to what should be included under the term. One of Mill's definitions is as follows: everything forms part of wealth which has power of purchasing. This exactly agrees with the definition adopted 1300 years ago by the ancients, and includes everything which can be bought and sold or exchanged, whatever its nature or form may be, and evidently comprehends all the three orders of economic quantities. Now, let us see how far Mill is consistent with himself. After giving this wide and general definition, he shortly afterwards attempts a second, and identifies the production of wealth, the extraction of the instruments of human subsistence and enjoyment from the materials of the globe. Mill admits that industrial qualities are wealth. Now, how are industrial qualities extracted from the materials of the globe? Mill admits that personal credit is wealth. How is a merchant's or banker's credit extracted from the materials of the globe? Mill admits that a credit given by a solvent banker or merchant is of the same value as gold, and therefore wealth. How is a credit, a mere abstract right of action, extracted from the materials of the globe? Elsewhere, Mill speaks of wealth as being the product of land, labor, and capital, but how are personal qualities and abstract rights the product of land, labor, and capital? We might point out several other self-contradictions of Mill on the nature of wealth, but that would be too wearisome for our readers. Mill says that everyone has a sufficiently correct knowledge of the meaning of wealth, and now it is seen that he has no consistent ideas on the subject himself. 1. The science of economics. 25. The fact is that Say and Mill have brought the science to a complete impasse. The expression, production, distribution, and consumption of wealth was expressly restricted to the commerce or exchanges of material products only, and when we introduce personal qualities and abstract rights into the science, as Adam Smith, Say, and Mill have rightly done, it throws the whole subject into irremediable confusion. There is no possibility of erecting the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth into any sort of scientific system. If we are to attain that end, we must revert to the concept of economics as the science of exchanges, or of commerce, as the most advanced economists are now doing. And then we have a body of phenomena capable of being erected into an exact and definite science as astronomy, optics, or any other. We shall now see the bearings of the doctrines of the economists and Adam Smith on free trade. The economists established it as one of the fundamental rights of mankind that they should be allowed to exchange their products and services freely with one another. Now, it is evident that when men agree to exchange their products and services, the arrangement of the price or value of the reciprocal products and services exchanged should be left entirely to the mutual agreement of the parties, the buyer and the seller. Who can tell so well as they what is the real value of the product or service to them? Now, when the price of the product or service is agreed upon and settled between the sole parties who are interested in it, suppose that some artificial force is suddenly directed against one of them, beyond what arises from their natural position, to oblige him to yield up more of his property to the other than he would do if the arrangement were left perfectly free. Such a force suddenly put at the disposal of either party, whatever its nature be, whether moral or material, would clearly be unjust in its very nature, and would be nothing more than a license enabling one party to rob the other. It may be asserted in the broadest possible terms that 26. A policy of free exchange. 1. It is the natural right of every man to employ his industry and the talents which Providence has given him in the manner which he considers to be most for his own advantage, so long as it is not to the injury of his neighbor. He has the natural right to exchange the products of his industry with those of any other person who will agree to such exchange, to buy from whom he will, and to sell to whom he can. A law which seeks to check the course of this free exchange is inherently wrong, and because inherently wrong, inherently mischievous. And, though it may be permitted to take something from him for the necessities of the state, which is the guardian of the interests of all, a law which deprives one class of the community of a part of their property in order to bestow it upon another class is an intolerable violation of natural justice. If a person forcibly takes away a part of his property from another person without any equivalent, it is simply robbery. In the same way, if a man wishes to sell any article and can by any means force the buyer to pay a higher price for it than he otherwise would, it is simply despoiling him of part of his property and appropriating it to himself. Let us put this in a familiar way. Suppose that Richard Stubble lives in the country and grows corn, and that his friend John Smith carries on his business in town. Having some corn to sell, Richard proposes to have a transaction with his friend John. The free marketable value of the corn is 40s per quarter. But suppose that Richard has about 100 times more influence over the legislature than John has, and he gets them to pass a law by which he can compel John to pay him 50 seconds for what he could buy elsewhere. T for 40s. In that case, he deprives John of 108, representing so much of his industry for which he gives him no equivalent, and takes it to himself. In the medieval ages, great lords and barons used to keep armed retainers whom they employed to plunder any unfortunate travelers who came within their power. In the 19th century, the governing classes passed laws by which they forced traders to surrender to them a considerable portion of their property against their 1. The science of economics. 27. Will. Where is the moral difference between the two cases? When one man forcibly and unjustly deprives another man of his property, the precise method he may adopt for his purpose does not materially affect the moral aspect of the thing. It is no argument to say that till comparatively recent times the protective system was established in this country, that it is still in force in foreign countries, and that it was supported and adopted by men of unblemished character and integrity. It is absolutely necessary that we should not suffer our estimation of the moral character of men to influence our view as to the soundness of their opinions. There never prevailed a pernicious error in the world which was not supported by the authority of men of eminent personal virtue. It is, unfortunately, through the very excellence of the men who adopted them, that most of the erroneous principles which have done so much mischief in the world derived their fatal influence. The real question is not whether the men who hold certain opinions are estimable, but whether the opinions themselves are right or wrong. The fact is that questions are examined with greater care and more searching criticism nowadays than ever they were before, and by this more comprehensive investigation, new considerations and relations are discovered. Arguments drawn from equity, sometimes well-founded, sometimes the reverse, are every day obtaining greater influence in legislation, and many of the most beneficial reforms of the present day have been to abolish and set aside the partial and unjust laws which encumbered the statute book. It is not so very long ago that public opinion in this country tolerated the slave trade, and men of eminent piety saw no harm in stealing men from their homes and transporting them to foreign countries to labor for the benefit of their masters. But public opinion became convinced of its abomination, and not only put it down, but declared it to be a great crime. What was considered to be legitimate traffic at the beginning of the century is now declared by law to be piracy, and Englishmen who engage in it are liable to be dealt with as pirates little more than 100 years ago, if 28. A policy of free exchange. 1. A gale came on. It used to be the custom to pitch the Negroes overboard like cattle, and this was related in a court of law, without eliciting the slightest comment. Now, at bottom, there is not much difference in the idea involved in protection and the slave trade. They both seek to effect the same object by somewhat different methods. They are both for the purpose of enabling one set of men to appropriate to themselves the fruits of their neighbor's industry, the one by the coarse method of force, the other by the somewhat more refined method of fraudulent taxation. Lord Macaulay remarks that the two greatest and most salutary social revolutions which have taken place in England were those which, in the 13th century, put an end to the tyranny of nation over nation, and which, a few generations later, put an end to the property of man in man. To these, we may venture to add a third, not less great and not less salutary than the other two, that great revolution in the ideas of the age which, in the 19th century, abolished forever the property of one set of men in the industry of another. The protective system is therefore nothing more than a method by which producers endeavor to force consumers to pay a higher price than they otherwise would do for their commodities. Now, let us consider a different case. Suppose that the legislature, being entirely composed of consumers, should pass a law forbidding the farmers to sell their produce above a certain price, or to export it to foreign countries where they might find a better market for it. Or suppose that laws were made to prevent workmen demanding above a certain rate of wages, or compelling producers to bring their products to market and accept a price for them much below what they would fetch if there were no such law. This would be a case on the part of consumers precisely analogous to what protection is on the part of producers. This form of injustice did formerly prevail to a certain extent in this country, but it never acquired a distinctive name in our language as it did in France. During the height of the horrors of the French Revolution in 1793, when the science of economics, 29. Insecurity of property had scared away almost all sorts of produce from the market. The French Convention passed the severest laws to limit the price of commodities, forbidding persons to sell their produce above a certain fixed price, whence they were called the laws of the maximum. As might have been foreseen, these laws only aggravated the evil, and their disastrous effects are set forth with great minuteness in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th volumes of Allison's History of Europe, 7th edition, though the author overlooks the fact that the very same objections apply against the system of protection, of which he is so strong an advocate. Each of these systems, then, is erroneous, but in opposite directions. That of protection, by which the producer obliges the consumer to buy from him his produce at a price above its natural value, that of the maximum, by which the consumer obliges the producer to sell to him his produce at a price below its natural market value. Now, every law which interferes with the natural course of trade, which attempts to regulate the wages of labor or the price of commodities, which attempts to meddle with the free exchange of industry or products between man and man, must necessarily fall under one of these forms of error. Every such law sins against natural justice, more or less, in one direction or the other, either as it assumes the form of protection or the maximum, and it is just as clear as the sun at noonday that the only true, just, and proper course is to establish and maintain absolute freedom of exchange. The fact is that both of these erroneous systems protection and the maximum are forms of socialism. They are both especially designed for the very purpose of interfering with the natural value of commodities. Consequently, whichever of the parties is enabled to compel the other to part with his property at a different rate than what he would, if unconstrained, is able to appropriate to himself a portion of the other's property. And this is the very essence of socialism. Protection is the socialism of producers. The maximum is the socialism of consumers. And nothing is more natural to find. A policy of free exchange. Then that where the one doctrine is popular with one party, the other doctrine is popular with the other party. Of this we may see examples in foreign countries where protection is the creed of the state and socialism is the alarmingly increasing creed of the people. Now, the idea which was at the root of all this legislation was that cost of production should regulate value, and that those who had produced articles had the right to have remunerative prices secured to them by law. This idea was a very natural one to occur to producers, and when we think of the condition of Parliament when this species of legislation was in fashion, it is not surprising that it prevailed. In the last century, it is true, there were at various times laws enacted for disturbing the natural course of commerce, but the Corn Laws, which lasted with various alterations until Sir Robert Peel abolished them, were made in 1815. Now, what was the state of Parliament at that time? One branch was entirely composed, as it still is, of agriculturists, the other principally of agriculturists, and the nominees of agriculturists, as well as great manufacturers, great merchants, great shipowners, and great producers of all sorts. It was entirely a parliament of sellers, a vast, close, and corrupt combination. The great body of the people, i.e. the consumers, had very little influence in the House of Commons. The sellers had a complete monopoly of lawmaking, and their legislation is exactly what might have been expected. All the producers, in turn, were permitted to plunder the public for their own benefit. It was nothing more than a gigantic conspiracy of all the sellers against all the buyers. These laws were a striking proof that no single interest can be entrusted to frame laws for the whole community in a spirit of justice, but, to ensure that, all interests must have a voice. These considerations are, we think, sufficient to place the doctrine of free exchange on an impregnable moral basis, and we have now to consider the effect of Adam Smith's demonstration that in commerce both sides gain. This, of all the services he has done to economics, may be considered his chief achievement, one which alone, from its stupendous, the science of economics, 31, effects on national policy, would entitle him to immortal glory. The essence of Adam Smith's doctrine is that the wider and more extensive commercial intercourse is among nations, the more prosperous and wealthy they all become. Every one, in seeking his own advantage, benefits others as well, because if a man wants to acquire any object, he must have to offer in exchange for it something which other people want. Different countries have different advantages for producing commodities for the enjoyment and satisfaction of mankind. It is the interest of the whole world that all commodities should be produced in those places where they can be obtained best and cheapest, and exported to those places where they can only be produced of inferior quality and at a greater cost. Thus, the whole world will obtain the greatest amount of enjoyments and satisfactions at the least labor and cost. Thus, absolute freedom of commerce and exchange throughout the whole world is the true nature of things, But when hostile tariffs are interposed, they act at once as a barrier and diminish the commercial intercourse of nations to their mutual loss and impoverishment. Protective tariffs are expressly made for the purpose of forcing commerce out of its natural course and development, and that alone is sufficient to condemn them. This is so obvious that we need not dwell on it further. It is, however, necessary to correct an assertion which is by no means uncommon. It is well known that Cobden, in his wonderful campaigns many times, declared that if England would lead the way, other nations would quickly adopt free trade. At that time, there seemed every prospect that this hope would be realized. The success of free trade legislation in England gave an immense stimulus to free trade doctrines. In France, the birthplace and cradle of economics and free trade, in 1846 and 1847, numerous economists, among whom Michel Chevalier and Frédéric Bastiat were the most conspicuous leaders, got up an association and agitation in France on the model of the Anti-Corn Law League in England and excited immense enthusiasm. The movement, 32, a policy of free exchange, 1, had the best prospect of success when the French Revolution of 1848 broke out and quickly spread all over Europe. That, of course, extinguished all hopes of free trade. When thrones were rocking to their foundations and crowns were tumbling in the dust, statesmen could give no attention to economics. Inter arma economics sillet. And instead of economics, the wildest socialism got the upper hand. The socialists knew instinctively that true economics was their deadly enemy, so they abolished all the chairs of economics in France. Under the fatal advice of Louis Blanc, they established the Ateliers Nationaux, of which I have given an account in my Dictionary of Political Economy, where every workman was to be provided with work out of the resources of the state. But though the state could pay workmen to produce articles, it could not provide purchasers to buy them, so that to prevent bankruptcy, the Ateliers Nationaux had to be suppressed at the cost of the most terrible civil war ever waged in any city. Napoleon III, with the advice and assistance of Rouher, Chevalier, Cobden, and Mallet, negotiated a commercial treaty with England in 1860, which considerably relaxed the protective system then established. But this treaty was carried by the autocratic power of the emperor and was utterly distasteful to the great mass of the French people, who are now mainly protectionist and socialist, which are one and the same thing. And alas, France, which in the last century was the beacon to spread the light of free trade throughout the world, is now enveloped in the deepest darkness of protection and socialism, nor does there seem any immediate prospect of her emerging from it. Now, a considerable number of persons, seeing that other nations not only have not followed the example of England, but on the contrary have retrogressed and are now even more protectionist than they were in 1847, and that, up to this time, Cobden's hopes have been falsified, have maintained that what Cobden regarded only as a hopeful prospect was in his view the necessary corollary of England's adoption of free trade, and that as other nations have plunged deeper in 1. The science of economics, 33, deeper into protection and socialism, England should do so likewise. They clamor against what they are pleased to designate as one-sided free trade, and under the specious names of reciprocity and fair trade, they are calling for England to retaliate by enacting protective tariffs against those nations which have enacted protective tariffs against her, and so to do unto them as they do unto her. If this were carried out, England would have to revert to the darkest days of protection. It has been frequently said that if Cobden were alive now and saw the falsification of his hopes, he would advocate reciprocity and fair trade, as they are pleased to term it. But those who say so never studied Cobden's doctrines. Constantly and uniformly, he inculcated that England ought to adopt free trade whether other nations did so or not, and even if all the world were against her, as is pretty much the case at present. Having a perfect recollection of the great free trade discussions, I have no hesitation in saying that Cobden would have done nothing of the sort which the reciprocitarians and fair traders would attribute to him. His constant maxim was that the true way to fight hostile tariffs is by free trade. No doubt all these hostile tariffs are extremely exasperating. They inflict incalculable injury not only upon the wealth and prosperity of England, but upon the nations which enact them, and on the rest of the world. But if, as some hot-headed and inconsiderate persons urge, England were to resort to reciprocity and retaliation, she would merely double the mischief. If the present hostile tariffs destroy an incalculable amount of commercial intercourse, a resort to reciprocity and retaliation would destroy it infinitely more. As Sir Louis Mallet pithily said, if one tariff is bad, two are worse. If foreign nations smite us on one cheek by their hostile tariffs, if we followed the advice of the reciprocitarians and retaliated, we should simply smite ourselves very hard on the other cheek. Retaliation is not to be thought of. England may justly. A policy of free exchange. 1. Fume and fret, but she must keep her temper and possess her soul in patience. There is no remedy but time and patience. When protectionist policy once gets the upper hand, the natural tendency of its advocates is to strain it till it cracks. When protectionists do not reap the benefits they expect from protection, their constant cry is for more protection. We see this in Russia, Germany, France, Italy, and most conspicuously in the United States. In this last named country, there are evident signs that the people see that they have bent the bow too far, and the present government is strenuously bent on relaxing it to a considerable extent, but how far it will succeed time only can show. But whatever other nations may do, England must endure to the end and steadily keep the light of free trade burning amid despondency, gloom, and darkness, in the hope that time, experience, and reflection will bring other nations to a better frame of mind. One example alone is sufficient to prove the wisdom of this policy. Even in former times, when all nations were protectionist, there were always a certain number of free cities, and their wealth and prosperity, while all nations were weighed down with protection, completely established the truth of Cobden's doctrine. If so be, England must continue to the end as the free port and market of the world. Thus we see how true economics throws a clear and steady light on the path of national policy. We have now to consider the influence of economic speculation, true or false, on that new form of protection which, under the name of socialism, has in these last few years become so increasingly prevalent, and which is assuming more alarming and portentous influence every day. Adam Smith, as we have shown even in this brief and cursory sketch, did immense services to economics, but alas, he also did infinite mischief by his self-contradictions and confusion on the nature and causes of value. Aristotle said, "Value is the relation which anything bears to other things." The economists were perfectly clear and consistent in their, first, the science of economics. 35. Doctrine of value. Latrousnes says, products acquire then, in the social state which arises from the community of men among each other, a new quality. This new quality is value, which makes products become wealth. Value consists in the ratio of exchange which takes place between such and such a product, between such a quantity of one product and such a quantity of another product. And in this, the economists were unanimous. Now, it is evident that if value is a ratio, there can be no such thing as intrinsic value, and also that a standard of value is impossible by the very nature of things. Value, like distance, necessarily requires two objects or quantities. Aristotle also showed that the cause of all value is demand. Krea. The word krema, which is one of the most usual words in Greek for wealth, comes from churho omikron mualpheota, to want or demand, and the ancients showed a thing is churho emual for wealth, only where and when it is churhozigmaio tamu omikronu, wanted and demanded, and that where and when it is not churhozigmaio tamu omikronu, wanted and demanded, it is not churho emual for wealth. In the ancient dialogue we have referred to above, Socrates shows that money is wealth only in those places where it will purchase other things, and he instanced several examples of local monies which were valuable and were wealth in certain places, but which had no value and were not wealth in others, where they had no power of purchasing. All the economists of France and Italy showed that value proceeds entirely from the wants and desires of men. The economists were quite unanimous that all value proceeds from consummation or demand, and that where things are not consumed as demanded, they are no better than so much rubbish. Now, as all commerce or exchange proceeds from the mutual wants and desires of men, it is quite evident that value requires the concurrence of two minds, and that it proceeds from reciprocal demand. Our great philosopher Locke was, unfortunately, the originator of all the confusion which has done so much to blight the progress of English economics. Locke maintained that all differences of value arise from differences of labor. Locke's 36. A policy of free exchange. 1. Abstruse works are very little known, and if this fatal dogma had lain perdu in them, there would have been very little harm done. But, unfortunately, this idea was taken up in the early part of his work by Adam Smith, though quite discarded in the latter part of it, and his 5th chapter has been the ruin of English economics. Of this chapter, the distinguished economist and statesman Francis Horner says, "We have been under the necessity of suspending our progress in the perusal of the wealth of nations on account of the insurmountable difficulties, obscurity, and embarrassment in which the reasonings of the 5th chapter are involved. The discovery that I did not understand Smith speedily led me to doubt whether Smith understood himself. We shall now lay before our readers the cause of all this confusion. In this unfortunate chapter, Smith begins by saying that the value of any commodity is equal to the quantity of labor which it entitles him to purchase. Hence, if we denote labor by L, we have equal to 1, 2 liters, 3 liters, 4 liters. He then says that this is the same thing as saying that it is equal to the produce of labor which it enables him to purchase. On denoting produce by P, we have A equal to P, 2P, 3P, 4P. Then he says that the value of anything is more frequently estimated in money than either in labor or commodities. On denoting money by M, we have A equal to M, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters. Now, although it has been pointed out that these modes of estimating the value of a quantity are by no means identical, we observe that in this passage Smith defines the value of a thing to be something external to itself. Hence, the value of A must vary directly as L por M. The more of L por M that A can purchase, the greater is the value of A, the less. 1. The science of economics. 37. Of L, P, or M that A can purchase, the less is the value of A. It is also perfectly clear that if any change takes place in the relation between A and these quantities, the value of A has changed. Hence, Smith admits that value, like distance, requires two objects. If any change takes place in the position of these two objects, the distance between them has changed, no matter in which the change has taken place. So if any change takes place in the relation of two quantities, their value has changed, no matter in which the change takes place. Hence, it is clear that there can be no such thing as invariable value. Nothing whatever can have invariable value unless its exchangeable relation with everything else is fixed. Hence, we can at once see that, by the very nature of things, there can be no such thing as an invariable standard of value by which to measure the value of other things, because by the very nature of things, the very condition of anything being invariable in value is that nothing else shall vary in value, and that there shall be no variations to measure. Nevertheless, a very large body of economists have set out upon this wild goose chase, this search for an invariable standard of value, which it is utterly contrary to the nature of things should exist at all. Directly after the passage we have referred to, Smith commences the search for that single thing which is the invariable standard of value. He says that gold and silver will not do because they vary in their value. Sometimes they can purchase more and sometimes less. Of labor and commodities. Then he says, but as a measure of quantity, such as the natural foot, fathom, or handful, which is always varying its own quantity, can never be an accurate measure of the quantity of other things. So a commodity, which is itself continually varying in its own value, can never be an accurate measure of the value of other commodities, equal quantities of labor at all. Times and places may be said to be of equal value to the laborer. In his ordinary state of health, strength, and spirits, in the ordinary degree of his skill and dexterity, he must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his, 38, a policy of free exchange, liberty, and his happiness. The price which he pays must always be the same, whatever the quantity of goods which he receives in return for it. Of these, indeed, it may sometimes purchase a greater and sometimes a smaller quantity, but it is their value which varies, not that of the laborer which purchases them. At all times and places that is dear which it is difficult to come at, or which it costs much labor to acquire, and that cheap which is to be had easily, or with very little labor. Labor alone, therefore, never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. It is their real price. Money is their nominal price only. But though equal quantities of labor are always of equal value to the laborer, yet to the person who employs him they appear sometimes to be greater and sometimes of smaller value. Labor, therefore, it appears evidently is the only universal, as well as the only accurate measure of value, or the only standard by which we can compare the value of different commodities at all times and places. The utter confusion of ideas in these passages is manifest. A foot, or a fathom, is an absolute quantity, and of course may increase or decrease by itself, but value, by Smith's own definition, is a ratio which requires two quantities, and therefore we might just as well say that because a foot which is constantly varying its own length cannot be an accurate measure of the length of other things. Therefore, a quantity which is always varying its own ratio cannot be an accurate measure of the ratio of other things. This is utter confusion of idea. We may measure a tree with a yard because they are each of them single quantities, but it is impossible that a single quantity can be the measure of a ratio. It is manifestly impossible to say that. A, B, X. It is manifestly absurd to say that 4 is to 5 as 8, without saying as 8 is to what, just as it is absurd to say that a horse. 1. The science of economics. 39. Gallops at the rate of 20 miles without saying in what time. But Smith says that equal quantities of labor are always of equal value. What? If a man is paid 5 shillings for a certain amount of labor, is his labor of the same value to him as if he were paid 1,000 pounds? This certainly is a very comfortable doctrine for the employer, because if he pays his workmen 1 shilling a week, according to Smith, their labor is of just as much value to them as if he paid them 20 shillings a week. We doubt whether the workmen would acquiesce in this view. Smith himself says that gold and silver vary in their value because they sometimes can purchase more and sometimes less of other things. But when labor sometimes earns more wages and sometimes less wages, does it not also vary in its value? How, then, can its value be invariable? How is its value to be determined on principles different from those which govern the value of gold and silver? The fact is that Smith's dogma that labor is an invariable standard of value is a pure mare's nest. Neither labor nor any other single quantity can be a standard of value, and to suppose that it could is only to betray utter ignorance of the mathematics of ratios. The term value has been so confused by economists that it will aid much in showing the confusion of Smith's ideas to translate them into mechanical language, substituting the word distance, which has not been so befogged in popular language, for value. Thus, as a measure of quantity, such as a foot, which is always varying its own length, can never be an accurate measure of the length of other things. So an object, which is always varying its own distance, can never be an accurate measure of the distance of other objects. But the sun is always at the same distance. And though the earth is sometimes nearer to the sun, and sometimes further off from it, the sun is always at the same distance. And though the earth is at different distances from the sun is always at the same distance from the earth. It is the distance of the earth which is varied, and 40%. A policy of free exchange. Not that of the sun, and the sun alone, never varying its own distance, is the ultimate and real standard by which the distances of all things can at all times and places be estimated and compared. Such is a fair translation into mechanical language of Smith's ideas on value, merely substituting distance for value. Smith practically contends that if a railway station is fixed, and a train approaches or recedes from it, the distance of the train from the station varies, but that the station is always at the same distance from the train. Can we wonder at the language of Horner? The cause of the confusion is obvious. Smith begins by holding the value of a product to be the quantity of other things it will purchase, and then he suddenly changes his concept of value to the quantity of labor embodied in obtaining the product itself, and he has not the slightest idea that these are utterly inconsistent ideas. Exactly the same confusion runs through the whole of Ricardo. His conception of value is vitiated by the same utter want of unity. Ricardo's work is avowedly a treatise on value. Now, Bacon and common sense show that before a person begins to theorize on a subject, he must first make an exhaustive collection of the facts relating to it, even the most minute, because a single fact which is irreconcilable with a theory is fatal to it. Ricardo excludes immaterial and incorporeal quantities from his investigations, which Adam Smith, in conformity with the unanimous agreement of ancient writers, included. He confines his inquiry solely to material things, and of these, he excludes all but those which are the product of human labor. Now, material commodities which are the product of human labor are one subdivision, and that by no means the largest, of material commodities which are wealth by unanimous consent. Ricardo then attempts to found a general theory on a single subdivision of one class of commodities which have value. By this method, he omits about 80% of the facts of the case. The various tyro can perceive that such a method of philosophizing is absolutely inadmissible. First, the science of economics. 41. He also falls into exactly the same confusion on value that Adam Smith does. He begins by saying, the value of a commodity, or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange. Also, the exchangeable value of these commodities, or the rule which determines how much of one shall be given in exchange for another, and several other passages to the same effect. But he very soon slides into the same pitfall as Smith does, and he calls the quantity of labor bestowed on a commodity under many circumstances an invariable standard, indicating correctly the variations of other things. He then maintains that if a commodity could always be produced by an invariable quantity of labor, its value would be invariable, and it would be eminently well calculated to measure the varying value of all other things. And in a subsequent part of his work, he says, the labor of 1,000,000 of men in manufactures will always produce the same value. That commodity is alone invariable, which at all times requires the same quantity of toil and trouble to produce it. Now, Ricardo's doctrine is that when manufactures have been produced, they are of exactly the same value, whether they sell for a large sum of money or cannot be sold at all. We doubt whether the manufacturers of Manchester would acquiesce in this doctrine. He then says, I cannot agree with them, saying estimating the value of a commodity by the abundance of other commodities for which it will exchange. Thus, Ricardo, in this last sentence, not only disagrees with the whole world, but he flatly contradicts himself. Ricardo, then, having excluded all commodities from his inquiry which are not the produce of human labor, roundly declares that labor is the foundation of all value. Ricardo gives an instance, which is indeed the logical consequence of his doctrine, which will enable plain persons to judge of the value of his system. As he contends that labor is the sole cause of value, he alleges that as fine weather, the warmth of the sun, and copious showers are the free gift of nature, they add nothing to the value of the crops. 42. A policy of free exchange. 1. If this be so, it is obvious that bad weather, storms of rain and wind, can in no way damage their value. If Ricardo's dogma be true, the value of the crop reaped cannot be greater than the value of the seed sown, because with the plowing of the land, the sowing of the seed, and manuring the ground, human labor ceases. All the rest is the agency of nature. Surely the naked statement of Ricardo's doctrine is sufficient to show that his whole system is fallacious. Mackay is the bondslave of Ricardo, he also asserts, that labor is the sole cause of value. Carey, the American economist, says, labor is the sole cause of value, and he adds, it is so in 999 cases out of 1,000. And if there be one case in 1,000 where there is value without labor, it is just the exception which proves the rule. Carey had queer notions of natural philosophy, for it is an axiom of natural philosophy that if there be a single case which is irreconcilable with a theory, it is fatal to it. Now, the superlative importance of this doctrine is that it is the foundation of socialism and all its consequences. Socialists avowedly base their doctrines on Adam Smith and Ricardo, and just as the astounding consequences which the economists drew from their doctrine, that in an exchange neither side gains or loses, cause Condillac and Smith to inquire into its truth, so the portentous consequences which the socialists draw from the Smith-Ricardo doctrine, that labor is the cause of all value, demand the strictest inquiry into its truth, because it has become a very prevalent dogma among working men, and a good many others besides, that working men are the creators of all value and of all wealth. In the brief space at our command, it would be impossible to give a full examination of the dogma commensurate with its superlative importance and its consequences. We can only touch upon a few leading points, but if any of our readers care to examine it more minutely, we may refer them to our theory of credit, in which is investigated exhaustively. 1. The science of economics. 43. Let us now test the dogma that working men are the creators of all value and of all wealth. We may premise that by the term wealth, in accordance with the argument contained in an earlier portion of this paper, we mean anything whatever whose value can be measured in money, anything which can be bought and sold, anything which has purchasing power. Now, let us take a few examples of wealth. 1. The simple space of ground upon which a great city stands has enormous value and is wealth. Did working men create the ground upon which a city stands and give it value? 2. Herds of cattle, sheep, pigs, fowls, and other animals fit for food have value and are wealth. Did working men create all these kinds of animals and give them value? 3. Timber trees standing on the ground, which no human being ever touched, often have very great value and are bought and sold. Did working men create these timber trees and give them value? 4. A whale was stranded on the shore of the Frith of Forth. As it lay on the beach, it was sold for 70 pounds. Did working men create the whale and give it value? 5. An aerolite fell in Sweden. The curator of the National Museum bought it for 84 pounds. Did working men create the aerolite and give it value? 6. Mr. Buckland says that at the Zoological Gardens, the dejecta of the snakes sold for 9 shillings the pound. Did working men create the excreta of the snakes and give them value? 7. The manager of a great commercial company, such as a bank or a railway, often earns by his business capacity an income of several £1,000s a year. His business qualities, therefore, have great value and are wealth to him. Did working men create his business qualities and give them value? 8. To professional men, advocates, physicians, surgeons, engineers, and many others, their capacity often brings them an income of many thousands of pounds a year. A policy of free exchange. 1. Capacity has therefore great value and is wealth to them. Did working men create their professional ability and give it value? 9. Mill says justly that everything is wealth which has purchasing power. Merchants and traders purchase commodities almost exclusively with their credit, i.e., by giving a promise to pay at a future time, and these promises to pay have value because they will be paid at maturity. Merchants and traders make a profit by trading with their credit. Their credit has great value to them and is wealth. Did working men create the credit of our merchants and traders and give it value? 10. The express purpose of a bank is to create credit, i.e., to issue promises to pay several times the amount of cash they hold in reserve. The floating rights of action issued by all the banks in Great Britain and at present in circulation are about £1 billion. These 1,000 millions of circulating credits have all the effects of an equal amount of gold. They have value and are wealth. Did working men create the credit of our great banks and give it value? We must now say something about credit, because the dogma that labor is the cause of all value has made the subject absolutely unintelligible. We shall first explain what credit is. When one person has the legal right to compel another person to pay or do something for him, he is termed a creditor, the person who is legally bound to pay or do that something is termed a debtor. And the right of action which the creditor has against the debtor is termed indifferently a credit or a debt. It is to be carefully observed that this credit or debt is not the right to any specific material chattel. The creditor has no right to any part of his debtor's property. That is absolutely intact. It is simply the right against the person of the debtor to compel him to part with some part of his property in exchange for this right of action, credit or debt, at a fixed time. It is, therefore, a pure abstract right. But the creditor can sell his right of action to anyone else for money, and it may be bought and sold any number of times, like any material. First, the science of economics. 45. Chattel. And because the right of action may be bought and sold, the Roman jurists termed it pecunia, res, bona, merx. The Greek jurists crema, pragma, agama, fateano, omicronica pa omicrons, omicronusig me alpha, osia phanes, and English jurist goods, chattels, vendible commodities, merchandise, incorporeal property, incorporeal wealth. So Mill acknowledges that the promise to pay of a solvent Merchant or banker is of the value of gold, which is very clear because the gold is the value of the promise. Thus, the whole mass of circulating credits or debts is a mass of exchangeable property just like any other, such as gold, silver, corn, manufactured goods, or any other. These credits, debts, or rights of action have value for exactly the same reason that any other commodities have value. Because at the proper time, they will be exchanged for money or its equivalent. The whole commerce of the country is now carried on by them, except only to an infinitesimal degree, and the aggregate of money and all these credits under various forms constitute the circulating medium or currency of the country or the measure of prices. The whole system of credit is based upon this principle that every future profit from whatever source arising has a present value, and that this present value may be bought and sold like money or any other chattel. Few persons have any idea of the enormous magnitude of this species of property in this country. In a return laid before Parliament by an eminent city firm, it was shown that out of £2 million of payments and receipts by the firm, only £40,986 were made in gold, silver, and copper, all the rest in different forms of credit, and some bankers found that in banking only 4 per thousand, or C0 25%, were paid in coin, all the rest in credit. Thus, if we say that 99% of the transactions of this country are carried on by credit and only 1% by coin, our statement will be well within the mark, and we may obtain a very rough approximate estimate of the actual amount of this circulating credit, because the best estimates of the actual coin in the country place it at about £110 million. Now, if we multiply this by 99, we shall find the result to a policy of free exchange. 1. Be £10,890,000,000 as the proximate actual quantity of credit in all its different forms in this country. Thus it is seen of what supreme importance it is to comprehend the great principles and mechanism of credit, if we would understand the commerce of the country and the theory of prices. Now, in no sense can it be said that working men created these 10,000 millions of credit and gave it value. Thus we see that the whole basis of socialism, founded on the Ricardian doctrine of value and incorporated as the leading idea of Karl Marx's Capital, is utterly overthrown. Labor, like everything else, has value insofar as it is exchangeable. Attempts to raise the price of labor by artificial restrictions on its sale are destructive of the mechanism of exchange from which alone value is derived. The theory of economics here developed contains a complete vindication of the equity and beneficence of the principle of free exchange as applied to all forms of wealth, to labor, to credit, and to material commodities. English economics can never emerge from its present deplorable state until we utterly discard the doctrine that labor is the basis of value, and dismiss from our mind the 1. Concept of economics as the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth by which it is impossible to create it a science. When we shift the basis of value to exchangeability and revert to the original concept of economics as the science of commerce, or exchanges, scientific order succeeds to chaos, everything becomes clear and simple, and we have a definite, positive, and intelligible science. Economics is the theory of value, which, next to civil government, is the most important thing in human affairs. It may be summed up in words which Michel Chevalier did me the honor to say contain the best definition of the science which has yet been proposed. Economics is the science which treats of the laws which govern the relations of exchangeable quantities. Henry Dunning, Mac Leod. Dwight, The Coming Industrial Struggle. William Maitland. Google. 1. 2. The Coming Industrial Struggle. We frequently hear now that the Manchester School of Political Economists is dead, and that the doctrines it inculcated are extinct. That this should be so seems to be considered a subject for general congratulation. Its policy is described as narrow and selfish, unsuited to the more enlightened and philanthropic times in which we live, while its professors are accused of want of patriotism and, strangely enough, of having sacrificed the interests of the whole nation to those of one particular class. Those, however, who have read the inaugural address of President Cleveland, perhaps the most remarkable declaration of policy ever delivered by any man in any country, though it has attracted far less attention in England than it deserves, may come to the conclusion that the Manchester School is not dead, but that, like a large part of the population of this country, it has emigrated to America and taken its principles with it. This is, perhaps, not to be wondered at. We are a very great and a very intelligent nation, and for the last 25 years we have been lecturing the United States in season and out of season on the folly of protection and the advantages to be derived from a strict adherence to sound economic principles. We have pointed to the marvelous development of our own industries and to the rapid increase of wealth and enlightenment among every class of the community as the best proof of the soundness of our advice, while we even ventured to predict for them an almost similar advance, if they would but follow our example. 50. A policy of free exchange. 2. How far we were honest in proffering this advice, it is difficult to say. The followers of the Manchester School could consistently do so, for they believe that their policy must be for the advantage of every country adopting it, and that every advance in prosperity made by one nation must be for the advantage of every other. On the other hand, many believed that American manufacturers were solely kept up by protection, and that if the United States could be induced to open their markets, their own manufacturers could not compete with ours, and we should obtain an almost complete monopoly. Even Mr. Gladstone, who claims to be one of the last survivors of the Manchester School, in a controversy with the late Mr. Blaine in the North American Review, some years ago on the subject of free trade and protection, wrote as if it were the special mission of the United States in the universe to provide raw material for our manufacturers and food for our operatives, forgetting that he was addressing the representative of one of the largest manufacturing countries in the world. However, America is now going to adopt a free trade policy, possibly because of our advice, but much more probably from her own bitter experience of protection, which has ruined her agricultural classes, has tended to accumulate wealth in the hands of a few, and has led to a system of making concessions to every class of the community which had influence enough to exact them, to the detriment of those who had no such power. This departure is far more important than at first appears. It may be said that America is only one country, and that most continental nations are still protectionist. But not only is America the most important of all as regards wealth, territory, population, and resources, but she is also the only nation which can really claim to be protectionist in the fullest sense of the word. She alone is raising a revenue far in excess of her requirements. France, Germany, and all other protectionist countries may gild the pill and endeavor to persuade their people that this form of taxation is a benefit, but every farthing raised is urgently needed for the support of their enormous armaments and the interest on their debts. 11. The coming industrial struggle. 51. They probably find it easier to raise their revenue in this form than in any other. But the United States, practically without an army, a navy, or a public debt, had a revenue far in excess of what she could require, even after allowing for many illegitimate drafts made upon it. And perhaps, for the first time in the history of the world, the enormous accumulation of wealth in the public treasury became a pressing danger to the state. It was this condition of affairs which gave rise to the abuse of the pension fund, and led to the reckless extravagance, to call it by no stronger term, of the last administration, which culminated in its defeat at the last election. But, opposed as I am to protection in every form, there is no doubt that more can be said in favor of it for America than for any other country. America is very nearly, if not altogether, self-supporting. With the exception of tea and coffee, and perhaps a few drugs, she can produce everything she requires in the way of food for her population, or raw materials for her manufacturers. If protection has failed in such a country, what can be said for it elsewhere? It has failed, and America is now pledged to a policy of free trade. While this change has taken place in the United States, the very reverse is going on among ourselves. Our farmers and manufacturers, or rather those who profess to speak for them, clamor for protection. Workmen are to be protected against their employers, the unemployed against those who do not employ them. We are to be protected against working too many hours, against getting drunk, against old age, against incapacity, against everything, except, perhaps, smallpox, by these new reformers. All this will require money, and enormous as our taxation is, especially in view of the present condition of trade and commerce, this appears to present no difficulty. Government is to pay for all the proposed benefits, and the necessary taxation can be raised from the capitalists. Coexistent with this public extravagance, as is always the case, there is the most wild and reckless private expenditure the world has ever seen among all classes of the community, while both public and private extravagances are held, a policy of free exchange. 11. Up as proofs of our marvelous prosperity. For years, the old watchword of the Manchester School retrenchment has never been heard here, and it now sounds strangely in our ears as it comes to us, across the Atlantic, from the lips of President Cleveland, as he preaches public and private thrift and frugality, individual freedom and independence of all government support and protection. The object of this paper is to forecast, as far as possible, what will be the effect of this change of policy, and what each country will gain and lose by it. But before entering on this subject, and to show how wide the lines of divergence already are, I propose to place in juxtaposition a few statements from the speech of Mr. Cleveland, in which he lays down the fundamental principles of good government, and some of the utterances of prominent statesmen in this country, belonging to all parties, unless indeed there still be a party representing the Manchester School. President Cleveland. While every American citizen must contemplate with the utmost pride and enthusiasm the growth and expansion of our country, the sufficiency of our institutions to stand against the rudest shocks, the wonderful enterprise of our people, and the demonstrated superiority of our free government, it behoves us constantly to watch every symptom of insidious infirmity that threatens our national vigor. It cannot be doubted that our stupendous achievements as a people and our country's robust strength have given rise to a heedlessness of those laws governing our national health, which we can no more evade than human life can. Evade the laws of God and nature. We should be wise and should temper our confidence and faith in our national strength and resources with a frank confession that even these will not permit us to defy with impunity the inexorable laws of finance and trade, closely related to the exaggerated confidence in our country's greatness which tends to the disregard of the rules. 11. The coming industrial struggle. 53. Of national safety, another danger confronts us not less serious. I refer to the prevalence of a popular disposition to expect from the operation of our government especial and direct individual advantages. This is the bane of republican institutions, a constant peril to our government by the people. It perverts the patriotic sentiment of our countrymen and tempts them to a pitiful calculation of the sordid gain to be derived from their government's maintenance. It undermines the self-reliance of our people and substitutes in its place dependence on governmental favoritism. The lesson of paternalism ought to be unlearned, and the better lesson taught that, while the people should patriotically and cheerfully support their government, its functions do not include the support of the people. Acceptance of this principle leads to a refusal of bounties and subsidies, which burden the labor and thrift of a portion of our citizens. That is, the neglect of this principle leads also to a wild and reckless pension expenditure, which prostitutes to vicious uses the people's prompt and generous impulse to aid those disabled. Every thoughtful American must realize the importance of checking at its beginning any tendency to extravagance in public or private stations, and to regard frugality and economy as virtues. The toleration of the idea of extravagance results in waste of the people's money by their chosen servants, and encourages prodigality and extravagance in the home life of our countrymen. Under our scheme of government, waste of public money is a crime against the citizen, and contempt for the character of our people for economy and frugality in their personal affairs, and it deplorably saps the strength and sturdiness of our national character. It is the plain dictate of honesty and good government that public expenditure should be limited by public necessity, and that this should be measured by the rules of strict economy. It is equally clear that frugality among the people is the best guarantee of the contented and the strong support of free institutions. 7. A policy of free exchange. 11.2. The existence of immense combinations formed for the purpose of limiting production and fixing prices is inconsistent with the fair field, which ought to be open to every independent activity. Legitimate strife in business should not be superseded by an enforced concession to the demand of combinations that have power to destroy, nor should the people lose the benefit from the cheapness which usually results from wholesome competitions. These combinations frequently constitute conspiracies against the interest of the people. When we proclaim that the necessity for revenues to support the government furnishes the only justification for taxing the people, we announce a truth so plain that its denial would seem to indicate the extent to which judgment may be influenced by familiarity with the perversion of taxing power. When we seek to reinstate self-confidence, by discrediting abject dependence on governmental favors, we strive to stimulate those elements of the American character, which support the hope of American achievement. Sir William Harcourt, I have already pointed to the growth of expenditure in the last 7 years, and I have nothing to say on the subject of that expenditure. I am not going to enter into any controversy with reference to it or to condemn it, but this, at least, I may say that those who have authorized, encouraged, and insisted upon it, I am speaking now entirely without distinction of party, for it has not been one party alone, are bound to provide the means of defraying it. I know there was once in this country an economical party, laughter, but there is no economical party now, and I believe that the Prime Minister and myself are the only survivors of it, laughter. There has been attributed to me a saying, which have attempted and, to some extent, succeeded in forcing the government to conform to their demands. What Mr. Cleveland here refers to the great trusts and monopolies which have ruled the markets for some years past, but his words are equally applicable to combinations in this case which have ruled the markets for some years past, but his words are equally applicable to combinations in this